to look at scene 2 just in class today of Streetcar, and I think probably what you'll find as you go through Birthday Party and Streetcar and you alternate between the two of them, you'll probably find, even if you're not that keen on Streetcar, you'll find it probably a sort of intellectual relief in some ways, because it's just easier, quite simply. You know, the figurative meaning in the play is a lot more straightforward to access. It's a lot easier to understand. It's a lot clearer. And I think, you know, you will be all right once you've had a couple of scenes worth of this at picking lots of these things out yourself anyway. Birthday Party is a little more bizarre and needs quite a lot more explanation, I think, because it's basically deliberately toying with all of the expectations that you would bring to the understanding of a play. You know, it's deliberately trying to violate them. So in this second scene in Streetcar, it's 6 o'clock in the evening, and it's the following evening after Blanche's arrival, and Blanche, for a change, is in the bath, which she is constantly in the bath, and she's bathing. So this is a really consistent, as I'm sure you've seen already, it's a very consistent motif that's used in the play. Yes, Luca, what would you like to say about Blanche in the bath?
That's with Stanley's unbathing.
Yeah, there's a very sort of direct contrast that's sort of asking to be made, I think, between these two protagonists in this sense. You know, Blanche is constantly cleaning herself, and the bathing is obviously an opportunity for retreat, but it's also a sense of purification that it gives her, a sense of absolution from the past, you know, forgiveness for her sins, and a forgetting of all of that trauma that is that's the source of her torment. So this purification from the past offers her the opportunity of the retreat, and in some ways is like Stanley's kind of window gazing and reminiscences that he performs in Birthday Party. You know, so Stanley's opportunity for retreat and escapism is obviously, his life itself is a form of escapism, and then his reminiscences themselves are also these sort of illusory self-deceptions. And the very direct point of contrast between the two of them is that she cleans herself incessantly, and he is quite a smelly toe rag. You know, he doesn't wash himself or really care about what he looks like. But because of that, what you can see is the way in which they make sense of themselves as individuals. Blanche's sense of identity is entirely staked upon the way that she's perceived in a social context. Stanley is actively trying to make himself sort of almost antisocial. You know, that's the premise of his retreat from society. So Blanche's sense of self is entirely contingent upon the way other people see her. But in a certain way, so is Stanley's. You know, Stanley's sense of self is not necessarily the way people see him, but there's as much sort of affectation and performance, I think, in his rendition of identity. The difference being, I think, in Pinter, that Pinter really thinks, well, there's nothing really ever underneath any of it for anyone.
Yeah, his sense of identity just comes from him dominating Meg and then being dominated by the...
Precisely. That's really, you know, when you put it down to it, you know, it's complex, a birthday party, but in many ways it's also simple, that your sense of self really derives entirely upon or from hierarchies, relational hierarchies. You make sense of yourself in relation to someone else, and you're either bigger, better, stronger, uglier, fatter, smaller, thinner than them, and that's what ultimately constructs who you are, and that there really is nothing more to it than that. Whereas, you know, in Streetcar there is, I think, the sense that there is some form of authenticity beneath the performances, and that the performances are a sort of tragic consequence of the possibility of authenticity being marred by traumatic experiences. So Blanche's dress is a flowered print and is laid out on Stella's bed, and there's, I think, what you see in these early scenes from Blanche is this I think, sense of kind of territorial invasion, like she's kind of occupying the space, and that there is very definitely a sense of status quo in the social interactions between Stanley and Blanche, and then Stanley and Stella, and then Blanche invades and interrupts this. She invades the space and invades the territory, but obviously what we see is that Stanley comes to dominate that physical space, and then that life that is disrupted re-establishes itself in the final scene and goes on as if nothing ever happened.
What's confusing is Stanley here and Stanley
I know.
there.
I'm sure if you've listened to those things already, you'll hear the amount of times where I say Stanley, the one in the birthday party, Stanley, not Stanley Kowalski. So every time I try and remember which one I'm talking about, I just say Kowalski when I'm trying to talk about the Streetcar one, but the slippages are, you know, be wary of that, especially when you're writing essays. Stanley here enters the kitchen from outside, leaving the door open on the perpetual blue piano around the corner. So there's, I think, the piano, the sound that this creates is a reminder, I think, of the realism that New Orleans itself stands for. The realism of the world that Blanche cannot really adjust to and proves herself completely sort of inadequate in the face of. And the blue piano is that kind of signature, kind of melancholy blues jazz music that's so famous in New Orleans, that represents, I think, the distinctive quality of the place itself. But more than that, it represents the realism that Blanche sort of can't really confront. So every time you see this sound being used, I think it's often to create a sense of her vulnerability to these external forces that she can't really control or have any power over. You know, she is vulnerable. And you'll see that in the stage set. You know, the mise-en-scène in this play is very deliberately breaks down the borders between the internal environment and the external environment. And it's to give that sense of Blanche's vulnerability to forces that are outside of beyond her control, that she can't do anything about. And that's why she's constantly retreating into this bathroom, so that she can just kind of hide and cleanse herself in private. So Stanley says, "What's all this monkey doings?" And Stella says, "Oh, Stan." She jumps up and kisses him, which he accepts with lordly composure. So you have this immediately stark kind of alpha male, passive female hierarchy that's established in their relationship, and shows us the sense of power that Stanley adopts in this hierarchy between the two of them. But also, in contrast, I think, with perhaps Goldberg and McCann with Lulu. You know, when Lulu arrives and Goldberg ends up kind of seducing her, she very quickly falls into this very strange sort of electrocomplex female passive role with Goldberg. You know, oh, he's like a dad to me. And then for some reason she finds that sort of sexually attractive. Here, there is this very immediate sort of occupation of a passive role from the female character. And that, you know, Williams is very consistent in his very direct suggestion that Stanley is this sort of kind of embodiment of domineering masculinity, that he accepts with lordly composure. He is the lord of this turf that Blanche has dared to intrude upon. And so there's a real sense of menace, I think, about the way that he dominates the environment and the physical space. Stella says, "I'm taking Blanche to Galatoire's for supper and then to a show because it's your poker night." His first question, "How about my supper, huh? I'm not going to no Galatoire's for supper." So again, there's this invasion of Blanche in his sort of alpha male territory. You know, they're very clearly depicted on in those terms of a kind of fragile moth, remember, that she's depicted as in the opening scene, invading on the turf of this sort of domineering alpha male, this very aggressive, domineering male that sort of seems to command the space that he occupies. Stella says, "I'm going to try to keep Blanche out till the party breaks up because I don't know how she would take it. So we'll go to one of the little places in the quarter afterwards and you'd better give me some money." So we see here two things. You know, the way that Stella is extremely conscious, first of all, of Blanche's fragility in the environment. She knows that she needs to keep her away from certain features of existence in New Orleans because she can't handle the reality of a kind of 20th century urban metropolis. She just is inadequate and fragile in the face of this. But also, Stella's complete reliance in material terms on Stanley. Stella is in this passive, helpless role. And I think, you know, this is a very, I think, sympathetic play towards the plight of women. Streetcar, and to a certain extent, I think Birthday Party is as well. Both of them, I think, have real sympathy for the position that female characters find them in these plays. And then Stanley wants to know, where is she? And all of his dialogue, you can see straight from the beginning, is extremely direct. It's completely sort of blunt and raw and rugged, like the vision of reality that he represents. And in response to this, Stella says she's soaking in a hot tub to quiet her nerves. She's terribly upset. That line, I think, is particularly important because obviously, you know, we know this from I think even at the time, we would realise that was a kind of a ludicrous misunderstanding of the physiology involved in what's going on when you have a bath. You know, your nervous system isn't like in some kind of bizarre sort of passive wind down when you get into bath water. So there's a sort of old understanding of the involvement of the nervous system in anxiety. But what we see there is Blanche's anxiety. Because anxiety is constantly invoked in the 19th century as this sort of this ailment of the nervous system, as if it's part simply of the body, and that there's very little that you can do about it, and it should be treated like a physical disease. And so we see this, I think, in the way that Stella's trying to sort of excuse her behaviour, excuse the oddity and the idiosyncrasy of her behaviour by invoking this sort of outdated understanding of anxiety. But it's very clear from the beginning that Blanche suffers deeply from anxiety. You know, those of you who study psychology, you can tell from the way that she talks and the things that she talks about. Amongst other things, she's suffering most definitely from anxiety. A bit further over the page, Stella confesses about the loss of Belle Reve to Stanley. And he is interested in this purely from a material perspective. You know, he knows that, and he articulates later on in the play that he is destined to inherit anything that's hers because of the kind of Napoleonic legal code that dictates that he will be in a dominant position because he's a man. And Stella vaguely says, "Oh, it had to be sacrificed or something." So there's a sense here, I think, of delusions and lies that Stella immediately sympathises with, and I think give us the opportunity to connect it with, I think, Stan in the birthday party. You know, there's this willing, what I'd call the willing suspension of disbelief. You know, the willingness to suspend the kind of critical inquiry, and that's what we see, I think, in this instance, and often Meg acts on his behalf. You know, Meg completely believes in his sort of elusive self-deceptions and constantly tells the stories back to herself again. So I think Stella's sort of buying into Blanche's delusions here is very similar to the way that Meg buys into Stanley's. You know, there's in the initial sense. You know, eventually Stella realizes the extent of Blanche's problems and I think leaves her behind. But in the initial moments in the play, both of those, Meg and Stella, both buy into the deceptive stories that both the protagonists tell. Stella changes into a dress, and when she comes in, be sure to say something nice about her appearance. Now, this couldn't be more directly contrasting with Stanley and the birthday party. You know, make sure that you talk about how beautiful she looks, because what we see there is how fragile she is and how deeply contingent her sense of self is upon the perceptions of others. And Stanley and the birthday party is in many ways a stark contrast to this. And she says, "No, don't mention the baby. I haven't said anything yet. I'm waiting until she gets in a quieter condition." So Stanley just says, So this, and try to understand her and be nice to her, Stan. So there's this sort of, there's this immediate sense of the need to sympathize with her and to be kind to her, and therefore her fragility. But what we see in both of these plays is that those two things do not necessarily follow one another. Understanding someone else and being nice to them, I think, are sort of mutually exclusive in both of these plays. It's precisely understanding the other person that allows someone else to dominate them, to be tyrannical over them. And so the possession of knowledge of someone else in both plays, I think, is in many ways one of the keys to the domination and the manipulation of each of those characters. So you think about the way in which Stanley deliberately tries to shroud himself, and Goldberg and McCann seek to kind of possess knowledge of him and understanding.
Is that why Goldberg and McCann don't treat him nicely because they understand? Maybe what it is class?
Yeah, and that's one of the key things, and that's where all of this belief in kind of Pinterian language comes into the play itself, of shrouding the honesty and the truth behind the characters, you know, hiding the sense of authenticity, is because actually the possession of some form of knowledge over someone else is almost a prerequisite for being able to manipulate them and dominate them. And so Stella sort of seems to be naive to this particular idea, and is warning Stanley almost about, you know, don't understand Blanche and then use that against her, which is obviously precisely what he does. He does understand the real her, and he gets, you know, direct access to the real stories of her past. But of course, when we see this, Williams is really good at providing these real situational irony that occurs in the play all the time. You know, at that moment that Stella says, "Try to understand and be nice to her, Stan," she's presented singing in the bathroom this really irritating song. From the land of the sky blue water, they brought a captive maid. Do you think of the way that the song reads to someone like Stanley? You know, she's being imprisoned here in his house. He doesn't want her there. And then the song that she's singing is a reminder of her sense of being imprisoned in this sort of concrete, physical reality of New Orleans at this particular moment in time. So it's, you absolutely shouldn't sympathise with Stanley Kowalski in this play. He's a violent rapist. But she does irritate him sort of from nothing in the beginning of this play. And there are moments where, again, we're deliberately distanced from her, I think, in order to create that sense of moral ambiguity that both of them are so keen on. So this is a kind of insulting song to be hearing, isn't it? If you think of even its subconscious associations. It's a fairly insulting, abusive song to sing about someone's house. You know, oh my God, I'm a prisoner here. I hate it. You know, it's a snobbish sort of reflection on their poverty, basically. Further down this, he said, yeah, I get the idea. Now let's skip back a little to where you said the country place was disposed of. And Stella says, oh yes, how about that? Let's have a few more details on that subject. You can see constantly in the things that he chooses to focus on here is that sense of raw materialism. Tell me about the thing that's going to lead to wealth. Tell me the details about it. He's not interested in any of this sentimental, interpersonal sort of understanding that Stella is trying to invoke. He's focused exclusively in these lines on raw materialism. And that sort of direct fixation in the dialogue you see in the birthday party, actually from Stanley, at that moment where Goldberg and McCann's are sort of building up to their interrogation, and Stanley's desperately trying to get information out of Meg about the men. You know, who are they? And it's one of the only moments in the play where you don't have this sort of aimless dialogue where one character says something, someone else doesn't respond to it and says something else, and they're talking at cross purposes. Stanley, in that moment in the play, is directly obsessed with the facts about Goldberg and McCann because they threaten his material reality. And that's precisely the concern for Stanley Kowalski here, is that he's obsessed with the material reality of his wealth and his power, in the same way that at that moment, Stanley Weber, in A Birthday Party, seems to be obsessed with those details. So that raw materialism is evident in his dialogue at that moment in time. And Stella just says, it's best not to talk about it until she's calmed down. And he said, so that's the deal, huh? Sister Blanche cannot be annoyed with business details right now. And you see there a very clear conflict established that shows us that I think that there's lingering resentment between Stanley and Blanche that's not just sort of originated in the world of the play. You know, it's obviously come from the past. So that conflict, I think, here is between Stanley's sort of practical material reality and Blanche's sort of aestheticized self-deceptions and her illusory connection with reality. But I think you see that also with Meg and Stanley, I think, in that dialogue where, you know, Meg is obsessively wandering off in her little mind about these two gentlemen that are coming to stay at the boarding house, and Stanley is terrified, so he's asking for all the concrete details about why are they here, who the hell are they, what was their name, and of course she has absolutely no way of responding.
They're both called Stanley.
Powerful stuff. If you put that in both of these plays, the protagonists are called Stanley. Haha. Can I have a 7, please? No. You fail. Start again. So Stanley says, it is a comparison, but it is probably a comparison that a 3-year-old could make. Now let's have a gander at the bill of sale. And Stella says, I haven't seen any. She didn't show you no papers, no deed of sale or nothing like that, huh? And so what he shows that he has awareness of is this sort of language of power. He has the institutional language of law. He knows that. And it's very obvious that he's familiar with that and that he can't articulate, for example, feelings in figurative terms in the way that Blanche does. Blanche's language is much more poetic than his. His is extremely blunt and extremely concrete in its details. And here he's listing all these different legal features and documentation that shows that he is capable of adopting the sort of language of officialdom, you know, the language of orthodoxy and power. And you see that most definitely from Goldberg, particularly, I would say, and McCann also, but Goldberg is the one that, in that particular moment where he says, you know, the connections between this case and the previous case are both unique and singular. He switches into that type of language that Orwell is so suspicious of, you know, that those abstract nominalizations that become vague. So Stanley has the language of power in this play in the way that Goldberg does in the other one. Goldberg is the one that is full of the language of power, but in Pinter's play, it's completely meaningless in the same way that Meg's dialogue is meaningless. It's not telling you anything. It tells you everything and nothing at the same time. He, at the bottom, is very aggressive. I don't care if she hears me. Let's see the papers. So he's very, you know, unapologetic in his confrontation of this material reality because he thinks Blanche is kind of swindling them out of money, thinks that Blanche is swindling them out of their welfare. And he's relentless, I think, in his sense of reality. So he's different to Goldberg and McCann, who are, you know, I think distant from themselves, importantly. They're distant with themselves. And that here, his focus on material power is a way of him, in his mind, connecting concretely with reality, whereas Goldberg and McCann's use of this sort of language and discourse of power is just another sort of self-evasion tactic, you know, and really what is nakedly exposed is simply that the reality of power really has very little to do with the language in practical terms. It's another evasive operation of communication. And you see that really clearly in the birthday party in the opening of Act 2, in the exchange between Goldberg and McCann and Stanley, where they're saying, you know, they're sort of talking as if they're friends. You know, if you just read those lines with none of the stage directions, it would sound like a conversation between two people who don't really know each other but are being polite. But the physical sort of stagecraft is very deliberately showing you the opposite. So there's a tension all the time in those exchanges in Pinter between the language that's quite genial, it's quite polite, it's quite sort of well-to-do and friendly. There's nothing particularly wrong with it on the surface, in spite of the fact that it's kind of evasive and meaningless. But the physical nature of the way the characters play themselves and are directed to do so is what tells you about the reality of the power dynamics between the characters.
So kind of like the official language that both of these characters adopt is used in a different way. And the birthday party is it doesn't really speak to like purpose because they don't really know what's happening either. But over here, when he uses it, it's a direct view of what he wants.
Yeah, I think, you know, in Streetcar, it's more threatening and menacing because you know, ultimately this is a fairly sort of conciliatory play that resigns itself to the fact that material reality is dominated by economic wealth and power, and that's what Stanley ultimately represents in the play. Whereas in Pinter, you know, the official speak is just another evasive tactic that people use to mask what they really think, and that the language itself is not really a confrontation with reality, it's a mechanism of escaping from it. And so here I think there is more of a belief in power itself, you know, of material power and the language that's used to represent it, I think.
It kind of shows like the different nature of relationships that play shows as well, whereas the other one there's no true connection, which is also seen through the official language. But right now over here he's being direct, so there's a possibility.
Yeah. You know, in Pinter, it's completely that. There's never really any chance that anyone's going to establish any kind of meaningful connection with each other, and that the language of power is just another facet of that overall kind of bleak view of interpersonal connection. Whereas there is a possibility in here, and you see it, I think, most closely with the sort of Stella-Mitch connection. It's a very compromised and limited one, but it's deliberately suggested that. Sorry, Blanche and Mitch. Jesus, I'm going to do this so many times. Blanche and Mitch are very deliberately sort of directed in a way so that it looks like it's going to be the redemption for both of them. You know, that they're deeply limited, they find each other, and they look like that they're going to find their salvation in each other. So there is the possibility of authentic connection and communication. Whereas in the Pinter play, everything is a sham. Everything is this kind of farcical effort to distance yourself from the other person. Because that's, I think, ultimately, you know, Pinter is quite adamant about this, particularly early on in his career, that we don't really want other people to know who we are, and we don't really want to connect with them. It's extremely bleak when you fully understand it, but within that, we have to understand the sort of limitations of the human condition and understand the sort of dark humor involved in it. You know, the redemptive humor, I think, is the only thing that offers some form of sort of philosophical salvation, and so to speak. You know, Birthday Party is extremely bleak because it's sort of funny at times. You forget how dark it is from a philosophical perspective. It's extremely dark. You know, that every single conversation you have is a performative sham where you're really actually just trying to mask your authentic self and deal with the awkwardness that honestly sort of embracing that would bring about. And that there is no real possible connection of striking up an authentic emotional communication with someone. You know, it's extremely bleak and negative. And even though this play is a sad one, there is at least some sense that that type of exchange is possible and plausible in the world. But the tragedy in this play is that it's going to be dominated by a much cruder and much more kind of rampant connection with the concrete facts of existence, which is what Stanley is, the kind of agent of all of that. You know, the sort of rampant 20th century materialism and tangible physical power, you know, tangible kind of economic power. Blanche is, I think, while she's a moron at times, she is also someone with some kind of sense of moral absolutism and some sense of a commitment to something other than just physical reality and naked power. You know, she has some form of interest in something, even though it is itself a kind of outmoded and dying set of social norms and values. You know, I don't think Williams necessarily liked either. You know, I think he has sympathy with her for sure, because I think he sees quite a lot of himself in her, but not with the weird, you know, attachment to sort of old South values and the inevitable connection with racism that comes with that. I don't think, you know, Williams is not racist whatsoever. He had, you know, many connections with black people all the way through his life. It's not a thing that he sympathises with, but I think that's part of the overall purpose, is to give us bits of Blanche that we sympathise with, but also at the same time show us that there's flaws in the method of thinking of someone like herself. And you see this, I think, in this line, what we've just been talking about, Stanley's association with raw, rugged, naked, materialistic power. Have you ever heard of the Napoleonic Code? You know, the Napoleonic Code, really, when we think about it, is the origins of social, political, and economic and legal power in all of Western civilization. You know, it's his adaptation of the law of the Roman Empire. You know, so it really is connecting us back to, I think, the birth of that sense of naked power. You know, the Roman Empire is really the birth of that particular concept in Western civilization. And here we find it being kind of found all the way in 20th century New Orleans, the Napoleonic Code. And he explains here what this means. So this connection with power in this play obviously invites comparison with Goldberg and McCann, but this is actually, you know, in the premise of the play, Williams believes in this power. Pinter thinks it's a performative sham as well. Here, Williams is really, I think, making a strong case for the existence of this power. You know, that people like him are connected to material power. And he explains it here. In the state of Louisiana, we have the Napoleonic Code, according to which what belongs to the wife belongs to the husband and vice versa. For instance, if I had a piece of property or you had a piece of property, and Stella just says, "My head is swimming." All right, I'll wait till she gets through soaking in a hot tub, and then I'll inquire if she is acquainted with the Napoleonic Code. It looks to me like you've been swindled, baby, and when you're swindled under the Napoleonic Code, I'm swindled too, and I don't like to be swindled. So here, you know, this is a very clear articulation of the way in which he is viewing Blanche's whole evasive strategy as a material kind of hoodwinking of him. She is simply depriving him of economic resources that are rightfully his, ultimately. And that's because, you know, he pretends that it's a bit reciprocal here. He invokes that principle of reciprocity when he says, you know, what's mine is yours and what's yours is mine. But actually, he says, when you're swindled, I'm swindled. So you see his kind of, his naked self-interest, I think, comes through in those lines very, very clearly. And he, I think, sees the illusions that Blanche is trying to sort of cast over herself as simply motivated by materialism. But of course, his vision of her is limited. He doesn't fully understand her, and it isn't entirely material reality, when it isn't really at all material reality that she's trying to evade. I think it is to some extent because it's the loss of material wealth that has precipitated this crisis. But the thing that she's mourning, I don't think necessarily is material wealth itself, but the sense of social order and the social values that she associates with that material wealth. So she there isn't just that sense of money and power that's motivating her lies. And that's what Stanley thinks. Stanley sees everything in this very tunnel vision, one-dimensional way. That it's just to do with money. Don't listen to her crap. She's lying, and she's trying to swindle you out of money. He obviously pretends that he's okay with this, and then immediately further down the page says, then where's the money if the place was sold? Not sold, lost. He just cannot get his head around this. And again, it shows the limitations of his materialistic realism that he views reality through. And then you see the stage directions that Williams uses are so evocative and so concerned, I think, with the power hierarchies between the characters. He stalks into the bedroom and she follows him. He assertively stalks, that word is really evocative of his power and him dictating the agenda and her passively following him behind. And I think the physicality of the stage directions is one of the places where there are really interesting points of contrast, but beneath the stylistic contrasts, there's a real sense of connection, that the physical movements of characters actually often gives you a greater sense of the real power dynamics between them in both plays. And you'll see that much more when Stanley and Blanche interact, because the power dynamics between them are so stark. He pulls open the wardrobe trunk standing in the middle of the room and jerks out an armful of dresses. So we see this, the trunk itself as the repository for all of her clothes, but it's really, you think of it in a theatrical way. We think back to Dario Fo and that sort of meta-theatre. Williams uses it too, and this trunk is very deliberately invoked as a place, a storage for costumes, and that invokes Blanche's theatricality, that she's bothered about her appearance and she likes fancy clothes, but they're deliberately presented in this play through these props and through the stagecraft as being theatrical, so that her identity is deliberately invoked as a performance. It's not real, it's fake. And I think that's another connection with Stanley in The Birthday Party, because his reminiscences, the only time we ever really hear about him in any way that seems meaningful to him, is when he talks about the piano. And the piano stories are so deliberately unstable and so deliberately unreliable that we have very little sense of where truth begins and where the illusion ends. It's completely disorienting, but all we really leave with is a sense of, well, he likes the piano and he sort of thinks of himself as some kind of artistic figure. And that's definitely the same for Blanche. She thinks of herself as some sort of aesthete. She sees the world through a kind of aesthetic lens that I think is associated with illusions that perhaps are in some way necessary in order for you to sort of sustain yourself. Stanley gets hold of all her costumes, and it kind of makes me laugh, these lines. I shouldn't really, because he's such a mean bastard. But he says here, look at these feathers and furs that she comes here to preen herself in. What's this here? A solid gold dress, I believe. And this one, what is this here? Fox pieces. He blows on them. Genuine fox fur pieces, a half-mile long. Where are your fox pieces, Stella? Bushy snow white ones, no less. Where are your white fox pieces? And Stella says, those are inexpensive summer furs that Blanche has had a long time. And he says, I got an acquaintance who deals in this sort of merchandise. I'll have him in here to appraise it. I'm willing to bet you there's thousands of dollars invested in this stuff here. Now, there's a huge irony involved in this here. There's a huge irony that I think this is one of those moments where I think you can get an insight into where Williams' sympathy lies. Is that he knows that Blanche is theatrical, absolutely. But Stanley here then falls for it. He thinks they're really expensive clothes. And so the irony of this is that at the same time as he's criticizing her with this box of costumes that the audience sees as such, he's falling for it and believing the costumes, that they're expensive clothes, when actually they're not. Stella is telling the truth. So there's a huge sense of dramatic irony in this moment where the trunk is being presented to the audience as if these are Blanche's costumes. But Stanley, even though he's kind of aggressively confronting this prop, falls for their deceptions, and sees them again purely in terms of material wealth. And it's his limited vision here that leads to that dramatic irony. He can't understand that there's more to these dresses and clothes than simple money, and that they're not real. They're a performative sham. So this aestheticized performance, again, I think, offers a comparison not only with the way that Stanley talks about that piano story, You know, where he shows you that he's making it up on the fly. You know, it reminds me of kids when they come in and they haven't handed in their homework, like grade 9 kids, and they're like, oh yeah, I started doing it, and then oh no, I actually finished it, and they just change the terms of the story in mid-flow. And the changing of the terms of the story, obviously, it directly underlines that it's a fabricated story that they're telling you. And Stanley's story about the piano deliberately does that too. So this sort of aestheticized performance in both plays is about self-deception, but the huge irony here is that Stanley believes it, even though he's supposed to be the one that's directly confronting reality. But Meg, in The Birthday Party, for example, completely falls for Stanley Webber's aestheticized renditions of his previous life. You know, she falls for them hook, line, and sinker because, well, I mean, even talking about it in those terms is a bit of a sort of over-celebration of her intelligence, you know. She would fall for absolutely anything that anyone told her ever, you know, as long as it was to do with cornflakes or whatever.
Doesn't Stanley fall for this as well?
In The Birthday Party or in this play?
In this play, that Blanche is, comes from a place of wealth.
Yeah, I think at this particular moment in time, he is reading all this clothing that she's dragged around with her in the trunk as, you know, he's believing what she wants people to believe. She wants people to see her dressed up like a kind of Southern belle and think, oh God, she's rich. She must come from a noble family. And so, you know, Stanley falls for that sham here, but obviously later on in the play is fully clued up about her past. So that aestheticized self-performance, again, is another connection, I think, between the two of them. Stella knows this and says, don't be such an idiot, Stanley. You know, she can be quite blunt with him at times, which is always those moments in the play where you're like, yeah, go on, girl, you tell him he's a moron. He hurls the furls to the daybed, then he jerks open a small drawer in the trunk and pulls up a fistful of costume jewelry. You know, it's very directly presented as this kind of theatrical prop, and it's kind of fake. And then Stanley says, oh, what have we here? The treasure chest of a pirate. And again, shows his limited vision, that he's misinterpreting costume jewelry as a repository for wealth. It's fake stuff you could get from a costume store. And Stanley misunderstands this and thinks it's extremely expensive. And he says, pearls, ropes of them. What is this sister of yours, a deep-sea diver who brings up sunken treasures? Or is she the champion safecracker of all time? Bracelets of solid gold too. Where are your pearls and gold bracelets? So the hyperbole that he uses in this description of what he's found in her trunk, which is obviously a domination of the physical environment as well, I think deliberately shows us his limited vision of reality as well. You know, just because he is more in communion with direct sort of materialism doesn't really mean that he sees reality in its full sort of three-dimensional complexity. He's also limited just because he's not sort of self-deceptive and hubristic. He only can see the kind of physical, tangible, the concrete. He can't really see anything beyond that, you know, the kind of moralistic or the aesthetic. Neither of those two ways of looking at reality are within his remit. He's limited in his vision too. And then he goes off on a rant here. Are you kidding? I have an acquaintance that works at a jewelry store. I'll have him in here to make an appraisal of this. Here's your plantation or what was left of it here. You have no idea how stupid and horrid you're being. Now close that trunk before she comes out of the bathroom. He kicks the trunk, partly closed, and sits on the kitchen table. So his aggressive treatment of her deceptions, I think, is a constant warning in the play that he is not going to in any way tolerate the delusions that she labours under and to create in order to allow herself to carry on. You know, her life requires all this self-deception because she can't nakedly confront reality because she's traumatized. But he is going to be completely intolerant of these deceptive illusions. And there are times in this play, you know, you absolutely should not sympathize with Stanley in absolute terms in the play. But there are moments in the beginning of the play where Blanche is bloody annoying. She is really annoying. She is actually quite sort of xenophobic and sort of prejudiced in terms of socioeconomic class.
Is this a point of comparison between the two plays that you can't sympathize with any character?
It's very different, I think, particularly the protagonists. It's very difficult to fully empathize with either of these protagonists because both of them have flawed characters that are missing in some way. Some vital component of what the playwrights clearly believe would make for a sort of fully comprehensive, fully reconciled identity. You know, in Stanley, in the birthday party, he's missing a sense of action and commitment. He's feeble and inert. But Goldberg and McCann are purely almost just, they're sort of pure effort and energy. They're nothing more than that. And then here, you know, Blanche is self-deceptive and kind of drifty, but she does have a sense of moral value and an ability to see the world through the lens of aestheticism. Stanley's the opposite and sees the world through the lens of concrete reality, but can't understand, can't be sympathetic in imaginative terms, and absolutely sees nothing for its aesthetic value whatsoever. And you have to think, you know, that's a major criticism from a playwright, and particularly a very kind of expressive, deliberately aesthetic playwright like Williams. You know, he's very self-consciously artistic, and someone like Stanley, who is so bluntly opposed to sort of aesthetic visions of reality, is obviously going to be the subject of criticism in a play by a playwright like Williams. You know, everywhere in this play is an aestheticization. You know, this play is heavily aestheticized in a naked, sort of explicit way, all the way through. The stage directions, the music, the costumes, the props, everything. You know, it's like operatic theatre. Everything is telling you something. Whereas the birthday party is like, you know, all of that, get rid of all of it. And let's just focus on the way people talk to each other in the smallest possible way. You know, that it's a sort of stripping back of all of that figurative communication that goes on in stagecraft. Stanley here says, the Kowalskis and the Dubois have very different notions. And I think it's the understatement of the century. And Stella says, indeed they have, thank heavens. I'm going outside. And I think one of the important things here is that this actually brings out the kind of snooty old Southern belle in Stella, his initial hostility. Because she is in touch with reality. She is able to adapt to the realities of the 20th century. You know, and she willingly and consciously decides to in the end, when she is told that Stanley's raped her sister and chooses not to believe the story and reflects consciously on that decision. You know, she says, I can't believe it and keep willingly living with him. She chooses to adapt to that reality. But here he is, in spite of that pragmatism in her character, his limited vision is drawing out the snobbery in her. And so I think that sort of at least allows us to sympathise with Blanche a little more when they eventually exchange in that hostile fashion in the later parts of the scene and the poker scene. So when Blanche says, indeed they have, thank heavens, there is, I think, an implied kind of sense of snobbery in this. Yes, I am very different from you, i.e. I'm superior and you're, you know, a scummy Polak and I'm a noble family from the south. So she snatches up her white hat and gloves, and that's absolutely not coincidental. You know, the clothing that very clearly marks her out as an old Southern belle. The white hat and gloves is a very sort of aristocratic costume choice. And this is what I mean by Williams. There's absolutely no throwaway lines anywhere. The stagecraft is lyrical in its quality all the way through the play. In the end, it kind of gets on your nerves. You know, it's like, shut up, Tennessee. Give us a chance to, like, make of something what we will. You know, it's extremely, it reads almost like a kind of, to me, it reads like kind of character interactions with a really sort of lyrical poem woven into the stage interactions. You know, the staging in this, you know, Tennessee Williams did have a crack at being a poet and did write some good poetry, but absolutely was a superior playwright to a poet. And you kind of, I always get the feeling when I'm reading this play that there's this sort of slightly unfulfilled poetic ambition being channeled into his stage directions. You know, there's constant symbolisms, constant figurative language being used in the way he describes the scenes, in the way he describes the stage directions. They're constantly invoking all of those sense of reality. And Stella says here, indeed they have, thank heavens. I'm going outside. She snatches up her white hat and gloves and crosses the outside door. You come out with me while Blanche is getting dressed. Since when do you give me orders? Are you going to stay here and insult her? You're damn tooting I'm going to stay here. So this is one of these examples of where the movements of the characters are telling us a lot more that's accurate about the hierarchies of power between them. You know, Stella immediately tries to give him a directive. I'm gonna move outside the door. This is, in this play, moving outside is an important sort of sign of an attempt to claim power for yourself, because it's quite a claustrophobic set in many ways. It's claustrophobic, but in this not anywhere near as much as the birthday party. The birthday party is extremely claustrophobic and disturbing. But it's claustrophobic in Streetcar in a way that it's trying to obviously show you that it's claustrophobic, because it makes the boundaries between inside and outside constantly transparent. So you can see that Stella and Blanche are kind of trapped in this apartment, but there is this giant world outside of them that they very infrequently get access to. So that stagecraft that Williams is kind of so keen upon and so expressive in his use of deliberately shows us the limited freedom that these characters have. And the fact that she here crosses to the outside door is an attempt to show some sense of power. But Stanley rigidly adheres to his guns. He's like, I'm not going anywhere, sunshine. I'm staying here. I dare you to try and move me. So that rigid adherence to his position, I think, equates the physicality of his acting, of his stagecraft, with power itself. And I think, again, that when you think of the birthday party and you think of the physicality of power, you think of that moment, particularly where McCann is ripping that piece of paper up and there's all these movements around the stage, and then there's that dialogue later on in the play where Goldberg and McCann constantly try and insist on Stanley sitting down, and he won't. And they do it to each other when they first arrive. You know, Goldberg's like, take a seat, McCann. And he's like, you take a seat. I'm not taking a seat. And he goes, okay, well, we'll both take a seat. And it's in that play, it's very clear that neither of them want to just show us that visual sign of subordination. You know, if you sit down in front of someone, it symbolizes either that you're kind of willing to see them as the dominant figure, or in some way that you're letting your guard drop. And this, I think, is the equivalent in this play to moving outside the door. Sitting down in the birthday party and staying inside the apartment in Streetcar are kind of the same thing. They're an admission of subordination. Moving outside the door in Streetcar is a sign of I'm going to show some agency. I'm going to take control of my life. Sitting down in a birthday party is an admission of subordination. It is admitting that you are inferior in some way to the character that has asked you to do it. And that's, again, comes back to that idea of we don't really know who we are other than we know who is more powerful than us. And you kind of, when you think about this, there is a sort of disturbing truth to that idea that you do know very little about each other. And I do think men are particularly vulnerable to this type of thinking of, you know, if you ask them, for example, how was your weekend with your friends? And, you know, this constantly happens to me. Beth will say to me, how was your weekend with blah, blah, blah? How is he? How's his girlfriend? And I'll be like, I don't know. I didn't talk to him about that at all, you know. But I will be able to say, yeah, he's been in the gym. His muscles are bigger. He's put on some muscle, or he's lost some weight. Yeah, he had some really bad clothes. His haircut was dreadful. All of that's to do with power hierarchies. All of that's to do with, oh God, he's bigger than me now. I don't like that. You know, it's establishing a really primitive power hierarchy. And men, I think, are particularly prone to it. I might be wrong here, but I think they're particularly prone to it. I certainly feel it myself, you know. And they you know, there's one of my favorite comedians, Mickey Flanagan, has a sketch about this. He talks about when he goes down the pub with his friends. When he goes down the pub with his friends and his wife says, you know, tell so-and-so I said hi. And he's like, no man has ever walked into a bar and the first thing that he says to a load of other men is that, oh, by the way, my wife says hello. You know, that is never at all what they would say. You know, immediately the first thing they'll do is take a look at each other and find something to criticize. You go, oh, God, what's that coat that you've got on, you moron? That's horrific. Oh, your hair sucks. You know, it's immediately some effort to attack you or to get one up on you. And so that weird interactive kind of power hierarchy, I think, is very disturbingly portrayed in Pinter. But of course, Pinter doesn't represent it in this kind of, you know, laddish banter. It's the condition of human existence, is that we only make sense of ourselves through relational hierarchies. And, you know, I know, you know, and it does happen. You know, for example, people in schools will say, oh, you know, that teacher sucks. And they'll immediately know who they're talking about. Oh, that teacher's really good. And everyone makes sense of themselves in these sad little hierarchies, and it's really reductive. But it's kind of true. There is a sad kind of truthfulness to this. And you know, if you ask yourself, do I know who the smartest people in all my classes are? I bet you've got a pretty good idea. And I bet you know where you are roughly in relation to them. You know, and it's terrifying when you start to confront all of these things. We're very good at like convincing ourselves that that's not the case, and we need to believe that that's not the case, because otherwise we'd all shoot ourselves. But if you really are honest with yourself deep down, you very often know where you sit in any kind of hierarchy that you choose to invoke. You'll say, oh yeah, I know the smartest kids in my year are X, Y, Z, you know, the ones who are best looking, the girls are these ones, you know, the ones that kind of suck are these ones, you know, you will always have a kind of naked sense of that reality. And that's really all Pinter's trying to say is, let's stop lying to ourselves. this is really all that's going on underneath all of this kind of jiggery pokery and communication with each other. Really, all it's about is I'm better than you and you're weaker than me, and that's it. You know, there's actually a terrifying kind of reductive quality to the birthday party that sees, I think, a very limited vision of what human existence entails. You know, it's just an effort to dominate someone else, and that everything else is a kind of sham that masks that kind of horrific reality. Anyway, enjoy your lunch. Oh dear. See, this is the thing. Everyone always thinks that you're some sort of morbid, depressive if you're an English teacher, but it's in the stuff. It's in the books. It's not me. That's not what I think.
Now we're just reading way too much of the book.
I am. Dear oh dear.
Couldn't it be that we just read way too much into the text than what we should do?
I'll say yes to that question, Luca, because if I do, then my whole life is a waste of time.